Man, it got uncomfortable really quick. Welcome to another episode of Get Behind Me, Jesus. I am your host, Joe Cash, and with me today is a new friend, and I'm excited to talk with him about the Church of Psychedelics. So, Doug, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us who you are, what you find yourself doing, how you came across me, and then what you hope to get out of our conversation here today.
Yeah, thank you also for the invite to your wonderful podcast. I got a chance to do a little bit of research before we jumped on, and you're doing some really amazing work. And from all of your testimonials, it shows that, how you lead your podcast and is really important to people. So yeah, thanks again, Joe. I'm Doug Redhill Pineda, and I'm the founder of the Church of Psychedelics. And I'm very much aware of how bold or how alternative that name is. At the moment it is. I've been involved with this for a very long time, so it's not anything that is this odd to me, but I certainly understand where we are in society at the moment. And as psychedelics have broken themselves out of prohibition, and I was part of that, helping with that movement. I come from a long history of all different kinds of things, like everybody doing what we do to make our way around in life. And I've been entrepreneurial. I've had massive successes and dismal failures, just like every entrepreneur. And also been involved in the corporate life for a very long time. But in the parallel life behind that, I'm a mix of Spanish, Mexican, and Native American, specifically Apache from that side. And there's not a lot of Apache around here where I was growing up, but there is Lakota. And from the Lakota people, they really brought me into their culture. And that's where all of my background and the beginning of my Indigenous teachings are from, and the foundational too. And so it was through a process of moving in from the corporate life, really going just through that. People sometimes have a midlife crisis or something like that. Mine wasn't a midlife crisis. I would call it a midlife awakening. And this midlife awakening was that, how can I keep on doing what I'm doing? I had one of those type of golden parachute jobs. Things were going great. I lived in one of the most beautiful places in the entire world, right in a little town called Lyons, Colorado, right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, where two beautiful rivers converged right in front of my house, and just life was really wonderful. But work was really in line with what has come to create such hardships in life nowadays, chasing the almighty dollar and the constant pursuit of, all of that entails. And without making this too long of an introduction and cutting right to the chase, I just couldn't do that particular type of work anymore. And I made the change. I didn't have a backup. I didn't have a net. I didn't have any security around that. It just came to the realization that there is not really any escape. You just have to decide and dedicate, and you're going to have to make a change. So that's what I did. And it was part of that where I was understanding to where somebody kind of at the end of I was working with Native American nonprofit organizations and Native American ceremonies, and just the whole community of just that background is the idea when we were trying to figure out, well, you've probably been involved in things like, nonprofits, and anybody who does that type of work, you realize that, you're doing fundraising, generating income, or, and donations, 80% of the time, if not more, and you're doing the actual work the smallest percentage of the time. So once I moved from that side of the corporate world into the nonprofit world, I'm like, it's the same thing. All we're doing is we're begging people for money. And I'm like, wait, hold on. My background, I'm an expert in business development. That's what I did. So why don't I just create business so we could create our own revenue? And once I did that, there's a lot of elements of Native American culture. Well, I know I understand we're in a modern world, and we have these modern ideas around economics, and colonialism, and those kind of things are alive and well. But even so, a lot of Native Americans are still only just 1 or 2 degrees of separation from the way that they lived for hundreds and thousands of years. This country is very young. We're 250 150 years old. We're an infant in comparison to other histories with other countries and continents. We're brand new, fresh, and wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, and we're still that young country. But for Native Americans, they're not much more than a couple generations away from these family lineages. Blood lineages are alive today from Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Black Elk, some of the most Geronimo, some of those well-known and respected Native American leaders they're not hundreds and hundreds of years old. I mean, they're hundreds of years old, but they're not that far from society. They're pretty fresh, and so are their teachings and their lessons before, the powers that be came in, and, that was a different type of genocide. And but a lot of that information is still not esoteric and lost. It's still here. And so a lot of that had to do with what type of revenue that we would get. Was it clean? Was it healthy? Was it sourced from a place of honor and respect? And so I'm like, well, where are we going to find that nowadays if we do that type of work? Like maybe we sell soap. There's no amount of soap that we can sell to generate the revenue we need for these projects, right? So somebody came out with the idea of industrial hemp, and that was the beginning of where all of this came from. And so I started looking into it. I'm like, well, hemp, isn't that weed? Isn't that just cannabis? And I realized that's when it got into a whole different level of understanding, where I started saying, well, how come we're not talking about it this particular way? And how come we're not, presenting it? And how come the government is repressing this and suppressing this from us? And this is food, fuel, and fiber. The seeds have all 9 amino acids. It's the only plant that provides that for humans. You can make ethanol from like less than 50 cents per gallon, whereas we're paying $4 or $5 a gallon right now for fuel. It's got the tensile strength of steel. For textiles, why are we using cotton with these little tiny strands and all the pesticides and all the herbicides and all the water it destroys and it takes? And the way cotton is one of the worst things, that and GMO corn and GMO soybeans and GMO, like those things, they completely destroy the soil. Why aren't we using hemp? It actually remediates on and on. So I grew a few acres and it was very successful. And this is the time when it was still illegal. And then with the farmer's field, I went inside of their cornfield. I grew several acres. And just like a few days before it became actually legal in the state of Colorado, I got involved in it from that point, helping it get it legalized in the legislation in Colorado. And when I was watching that, I watched the Colorado Bureau of Investigation just a few hundred yards away at another farm field, which was had signs of, it was industrial hemp. It was for research and scientific use. It was very well with signage of what that field was. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation came and burned it to the ground. That's when I started seeing, like, when I got into the background of this, and I was at the state capitol and going to the meetings and seeing from the background and getting involved with, hearing conversations happening in the hallways, I realized that industrial hemp was a big threat to oil and gas extraction. You have a massive multi-trillion-dollar, industry that's worldwide that feeds into all of these other subcategories and sub-industries. And who wants to pay $1 for gas versus $5 a gas? You're not going to disrupt that industry. So oil and gas was attacking industrial hemp. Just a few fuel fiber hemp. Fertilizers was a threat against fertilizer industry, which is also petroleum based. It attacked the food industry. You could take the seed of hemp seed with, again, all 9 amino acids and all these other valuable molecules and compounds that is helpful for human society, and make all kinds of things that replace horrible stuff that's putting into our body. So they're against it. It just goes on and on about these type of things. While I was there, I was watching what was happening around this idea of natural psychedelics coming through all the same legislation that I was just battling myself for industrial hemp. And on that side of the world, I was already involved in processing plants for hemp, having farmers come and bring it into a processing center, separating out the sticks and the stems from the seeds and getting it prepared for a laboratory. I also helped set up 3 different laboratories for industrial hemp. So we would take the bio of all of that hemp, and then we would turn it into cannabinoid products like CBD and CBZ and CBN and all of those type of cannabinoids. And so that's when I started seeing the healing powers. I would, on a daily basis, hear stories of, my 80-year-old mother is on 4 different arthritis and bursitis medications. And within 1 week of using just hemp, just rubbing it on her hands, for the first time in 25 years, she's able to open up her fists, while she's been for 10 years on all these medications with all these side effects that are masking symptoms. So I would hear those stories all day long, and I'm starting to realize like the propaganda and the stigma is real. Blatant lies about what are the scientists with, white lab coats and stethoscopes around their necks will tell you that it's bad and it's unscientific, it's an unverified and has no medical benefits. Blatant lies. And I started seeing that in natural psychedelics, that same parallel was coming over to them. So I got involved with that movement because I just knew the fight that they were up against, and I knew the curative properties that were coming from psychedelics, even though we had this Nancy Reagan kind of stigma that, and this propaganda from, since Nixon about removing natural psychedelics on behest of Anslinger and, pharmaceutical companies and all different types of, industries, they removed them from us. So there's no science has been done, no background, no studies, no research, in some of these things. And jumping forward to right now, and I'll pause here in a moment. I realize that I'm on a string of consciousness here, but
Yeah,
I'll
no worries.
where this came from because it's
We'll
brand
break
new.
it down. I promise. I've got a
Yeah,
lot of questions now.
we've not had this available to us. It has been literally in prohibition, just like I'm not trying to make alcohol's not the best one, but it's like that. A bunch of politicians in the back rooms got together and all of a sudden overnight no one voted on this, no one had any insight, there's no science behind it, right? And all of a sudden it's just taken from us and just repressed for 80 years.
Not only that, but we see in our day and time, especially as the curtain draws further and further back, we see that the people involved in those kinds of manipulations and
Yes.
obstructions are profiting from their cooperation with big business that's blocking these things.
Yes. Yep. So, that's a really good way to just kind of put some bookends on that to the, kind of like encapsulate that introduction. Just the idea that it's back, it's broken itself out of prohibition. It's now back in the consciousness and awareness of society. It is local to Colorado as that we've legalized it statewide. About 14 other states, I think at the moment, have some type of psychedelic legislation either happening right now or going through that process, all the way from just basic research where people still can't get a hold of it, but the doctors can now work with more of a Schedule 1 substance I should say not doctors, but just researcher scientists, at universities and research type centers and institutions can now work with a Schedule 1 substance a lot more freely. Just even though we're at our eyes just barely are blinking open to this idea, things that are happening right now that are really extraordinary, which is, I think anybody can make the mental logical extension, but I'm not trying to get into conspiracies. But when you start hearing things like they literally cure cluster migraines. I know that word is dangerous for legal reasons in the pharmaceutical industry, but this is not it can say my opinion, but go look at the research papers that are doing it right now. People are flying to Europe to do a medium dose of psilocybin or LSD, and things are being literally cured. I'm not saying this. I'm sharing this, but the people who are doing it, tinnitus are just showing the cures. People are talking about literally curative properties around Alzheimer's, dementia, sundowners, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis. People are coming out with have T5 literal spinal cord injuries, paralyzed from the sternum or chest down, taking a microdose of psilocybin, and where they're getting spasticity and movement in their legs, their abdomen, arms, places where the doctors, research scientists are telling them right now today, what the heck is going on? You should not have any movement. You literally have a sever of those type of neural systems to where you should not have any movement in those areas of your body. And their legs are kicking out, their legs are spasming and moving, their arms are moving. It's truly, I wouldn't say it's a miracle because it's always been here. It's just been kept from us like so many other things. And now it's come out with such a force that they're never going to be able to put this genie back in the bottle. The best thing that can happen though is legislatively to make this more open for everyday citizens to take their own sovereignty, their own agency over their own life and start to work and experiment with these things on their own ways. They're grown adults. This thing, psychedelic mushrooms, psilocybin is not addictive in any biological way, and you can never overdose on it. It's like THC. Yes, you can get really, really super high, but it's not going to kill you. It can't. It's like THC. You can have addictive qualities like social qualities around it, but biologically, it is not addictive at all. It has no particular side effects. It doesn't last. As a matter of fact, when you take a drug test for a job, they don't even test for psilocybin. It is so water soluble that it's only in your body for a very short amount of time. We're talking hours. By the time you take it and they try to test for it, you'd have to test for it within like an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 in order for it even to show up. It doesn't even remain in your body that way. So anyway, I'll pause there, but yes, it's kind of just setting up the idea that we have this really astounding molecule that was, God, provided this on the earth, and now we're back to the idea of how do we build a relationship with it and what does it mean to us?
Okay, so we've got a lot to dig into. And I kind of want to start with like the practical and the spiritual frameworks that you're working with. So practically speaking, and I want to talk more about the specifics of psychedelics, but I also want to talk about the infrastructure of your church and how you're putting together a framework within this movement. So a couple of different things there. But in terms of plant medicine, is there a difference between naturopathic medicine or naturopathic philosophy and what we're talking about here? And if so, what is that difference?
Good question. So let's start with the framework question. And the framework is just the idea that the reason this is a church is because of how this bill and how the legality is set up currently.
Mm-hmm.
So in the state of Colorado, I was going through the process through the Department of Regulatory Agencies. There are 5 or so different types of licenses that allows us to work with psilocybin in a legal way, right? Because right now, as it exists, it's kind of like the early days of cannabis when Colorado's the first state to legalize cannabis. So Joe and Doug could grow it. Joe and Doug could cultivate THC. Joe and Doug could have it on our bodies and drive it around, and we can use it at will. And we can do everything with cannabis that we wanted to, except for one thing. We cannot sell it to one another. The state wanted to make sure it gets involved. It makes sure that it wants its cut, and that's what the regulatory agencies do, and they manage that process. And so that exact process was exactly for mushrooms as it exists right now today. You and I can do everything what I just said, except for one thing: sell it to one another. So I was getting set up to do through the regulatory agency for a manufacturing license, since that's my background. I understand at the pharmaceutical levels of safety and compliance and dosage and purity and lab testing, all of that at the highest levels of that's where my background, I come to the table with that experience, as well as the indigenous understanding side and the working with indigenous medicines like these.
So from a legal standpoint, like you can guarantee, the purity of the product, the efficacy of it, and
Yes.
in all of the legal, I don't know the word, but all of the legality has been fulfilled.
Yeah, all the safety mechanisms, the legal mechanisms. So that's the safety and legal side. In this bill, though, House Bill 122, written by Sean McAllister, or co-authored by Sean McAllister, the leading psychedelics attorney in the United States, probably the world at this point, because it's so new. He was also in language for the indigenous use and consideration of, because this medicine, because it was thousands of years, in the use of and understanding of and the teachings of, there is, relations into that for the indigenous use of this medicine. Mm-hmm. And so that is, the legal side is very well structured. The spiritual side, though, isn't as well. And so that's where I decided to kind of come in, and that from the spiritual side of things is when you work with medicine with a sincere belief system underneath it in the form of sacrament, then you are protected legally, not just in the state of Colorado, but in all states. You are protected legally under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That Religious Freedom Restoration Act allows anybody with a sincere belief system to work with psychedelics, natural psychedelics, as sacrament. And so I wanted to help take that world and formalize it. Because of my background, I've sat in jungle floors with, psychedelic medicine, ayahuasca, on the shorelines and then by oceans with wachuma, in the mountains of, with contemplation with other psychedelic medicines, and meditations and ceremonies and those type of things for, decades. I have a long history of traveling the world with Native American esoteric ceremonies for healing people and communities. So I've got a very vast background in that type of the world as well. So I wanted
Hmm.
to take that legitimacy and that genuine sense of spirit around this medicine and build a structure. And so I wanted to form up and formalize the religious use and the spiritual use of this. I didn't
Hmm.
name it Church of Psychedelics to be controversial or to put it in anybody's face or to connotate some crazy little cult or to put it up against other religions as mocking them or
Right.
anything. Nothing like that. Because the word psychedelics right now I understand is very bold and alternative.
Hmm.
However, in just a few short years from now, it's back in the lexicon of all language around the world.
Right.
And we're talking about it. And just in a few short years, I don't think psychedelics is going to be any big deal, but it is right
Right.
now.
Well, first of
So
all, this is a safe community. We're interested in the psychedelics and the alternative. But second of all, speaking about your church or your spiritual background, I do have questions about, what that looked like for you. You mentioned your intersectionality and specifically your exposure to indigenous wisdom. And it sounds like just in our conversation so far that plays a huge piece in the framework that you're building, denominationally or religiously in terms of what you're doing. So I wonder if you could say more about how you grew up. Was it primarily indigenous culture that you experienced? Was it, specific to Christianity or Buddhism or things like that? And then how did that evolve for you as you grew up?
yeah, thank you for orienting into that because yeah, first of all, I don't know what's going on with my lighting, but I'm very washed out at the moment. I'm not trying to say anything about how to be, whatever, but yes, I am. My background is from a heritage standpoint. I'm Spanish, Spain, Mexican, and Apache. And I realize how light I look, and especially with something's going on with my camera to really wash me out on top of that. But that's just like I can't help that part about. But I grew up as an army brat. My father was in the military. He was in the army, and we traveled the world. He retired when I was about 15. So every 3 years, we were in a different country or a different state. And so there was not really a lot of anywhere to really land in one particular place with a community around me with Native American. But around that time was a lot of the background and, like I said, this country's brand fresh new. We're 250 years old. I mean, that's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. But the countries we traveled to had thousands of years of culture that really kind of went uninterrupted, except for, when colonial came in and, rearranged certain things. But so mostly it was from my background was I grew up Catholic. I could probably recite the mass in Latin. I've been to so many. My dad retired. We came to Colorado. I was about 17 and I was getting, 17 or I was 16 and I was getting up one day and I was like, oh, it's Sunday. I'm like, I didn't want to really go to church, just like most kids, whatever. And especially as a Catholic church, 2 hours Latin mass, like,
Hmm.
you're just like, ugh, I've got so many other things I'd
Yeah.
rather do today.
You
But
got
I
to be
went
really
upstairs.
into it.
Yeah, exactly. So Joe, my dad was making breakfast, and I was like, "Hey, aren't we going to church today? I mean, we should be getting in the car soon." And my dad's like, "Yeah, we're not doing that anymore." And I said, What's going on?" And I was really, and he was like, "They don't walk their talk." He was referring to the priests.
Mm-hmm.
And we had moved around, we looked at a couple churches and we had seen some, but something was going on in my dad's life as well. And he had really just had it. My dad was one of those people, he would go and sit and make meetings and go talk to the priest and ask him questions. And he's like, they're just not inspired. They're not
Hmm.
passionate. They can tell that they'd rather be something else other than answering his questions. They said one thing and did another, they didn't walk their talk. And my dad says, we can't continue to do that. He's like, there's a disconnect with these leaders of the church. And so he's like, until we figure this out or we get some more, so we're not gonna participate. So that's where that came from. And so it started within. And then my grandmother, who was Apache, she spoke Spanish and Apache. Those are her only two languages. And she had told him that as she was passing over, that she was really what's the word? She had wished that she had shared her Native American background with him more. But she said at the time it was looked down upon to be Native American. You were looked down upon to speak your Native American language. It was until 1978, even go to sweat lodge was prison time. That was 1978. Native Americans cannot even practice their spirituality by U.S. law, punishable by prison. Literally, no jury necessary. You've already got a defined prison. You've already got a defined sentence just by practicing your religion, your spirituality.
Yeah.
So she had said, she told him as she was passing that she wished that so that's what he did. So he started to resurrect our Native American roots and logic and thinking and philosophies. And we just started down that path slowly over time and little by little. And we called in to make connections with a medicine man that would come in and would talk about it. So I have this very deep, I mean, I can't even tell you, probably thousands of times I've been to church or, Catholic Christian type ceremonies. And then also now this new world of this Native American spirituality, and to see that what was similar and what was dissimilar. As a matter of fact, a lot of people may not know this, but even for the Northern Plains tribes, what they call the Buffalo Nation or the Buffalo Nations, Jesus had appeared to those nations thousands of years ago, thousands of years before Jesus appeared in Jerusalem and Nazareth. Even before all of that, he had appeared previously thousands of years before to the Native Americans. They called him Yellow Hand. That was the interpretation of his name, was Yellow Hand. And before that even was the appearance of what would be considered Mary. They called her White Buffalo Calf Woman, and she was the one who foretold about prophecies and understandings, and that there was this idea of consciousness and how to think about this higher realm of being and understanding. So there was, elements of that as well. So, but there's hundreds of different nations. And so you can't say one nation, the way they have stories applies to all other nations. So there is definitely some elements to, for consideration, but the structure of how we came about this is basically from a lot of those. And you talked about even Buddhism. From that point, when we stopped going to church, I was still very spiritually oriented. And there was no big love lost from the Catholic Church side of things, because I felt the same thing. I would look at these guys and I would talk to them and I would go help out. And I could kind of see that these guys were, these priests were, I'll give you an example. The priest who married me first was, a couple of years later, he couldn't even remember my name, but we paid him $500, or a few $100s to be that. And he came and ate and whatever and did his thing. And it was just, you could just tell there was a disconnect. So I looked into Buddhism, and I had already read all the books on, the art of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, and Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and some of these really esoteric kind of, books that I had written over time. And Buddhism, was kind of in alignment with some of those thoughts. So I looked into it, and I actually spent years, and I'm literally right now a 5th level Shambhala Buddhist. So I've been Christian, Catholic, 5th level Shambhala Buddhist. So what I do is there's a lot of inspiration from a lot of different religions to where we came up with the structure of the Church of Psychedelics, and we kept it very incredibly simple with our belief system, and it's called the Golden Path. And a Golden Path is just a journey of spiritual awakening. And the Golden Path is the belief system. So the Church of Psychedelics is the church. The Golden Path is the belief system, and the golden practices are the integration practices to the belief system. And basically the idea is we come through one particular doorway. So Joe, when I was thinking about this, what I was having to put this together, talk about the audacity to create a religion. It does not mist on me. But again, we're at a era of time in humanity. We have these medicines available. We have this structure that which we operate within. And so in order to create a sincere belief system, I kept it extremely functional, extremely accessible, and extremely just the idea that people could integrate into this. So I started with one framework. It's been said many different ways over the centuries, but it's basically this mantra, this saying: we are a spiritual being having a human experience. And it's this idea, like when you come into this realm of spirituality, how do you eat this elephant, right? One bite at a time. And one bite at a time, I thought if we started with just two separate ideas, like we're a spiritual being, right? We have our communication. We are an extension of God. We are an extension of consciousness. We are an extension of this field, this ether, this energy source, right? Divinity. That's our spiritual being. And then we're a human experience. This idea that we have a bunch of traits and behaviors and experiences all tangled up together. So how do we start to tease those apart, start to put them into categories? And if we have these two discussions, 5 pillars of consciousness address our spiritual being, presence and harmony and knowing and faith and hope and those type of discussions. And then the second discussions, we're having a human experience, truth, honesty, courage, gratitude, respect, humility, wisdom, those type of things. So we start to break them into the core components of what makes us human. And then what does it mean? What is the meaning of we're a spiritual being? And we start with those, we have a discussion around those two elements. And that's how we start to create the structure around a church.
Okay. So going back to your story of your grandmother and wanting to share more of her indigenous culture with your father, with you, and, sort of regretting that didn't play a bigger part because of the shame that was associated with that. First of all, just want to acknowledge the consequences of colonialism and how, for generations and generations after white men came and imposed religion, imposed economic structure, imposed what have you on the indigenous cultures that were already here, like we're still dealing with the consequences of that. We're still recognizing the deep, deep impact, like you said, in the 70s even, to participate in religious practices of the indigenous communities still carried legal weight, legal consequence. So like that's huge. That's huge part for people to consider in this resurgence of plant medicine and indigenous wisdom and the ideologies that are help supporting the framework behind this. So in a lot of ways, there is like a very epic reclamation and reconciliation that's going on here. The other thing that I was thinking here at the last part of what you were saying, I want to ask your thoughts about some specific things. A lot of what you said sounds like open and relational theology. And if you've listened to any of what I've talked about, that's the community that I'm a part of now. That's how I'm working through the trauma that I've experienced in a conservative evangelical church. That's what helps make sense of God and, my epistemological framework. So open and relational theology, I think, was peppered throughout what you were saying. But one of the things that I want to ask you about is this idea of spiritual beings having a human experience. One of the things that we try to get away from or correct in open relational theology is the influence of Western ideas about existence, particularly dualism, and the idea that the idea of the separation of the spirit and the material is something that has caused great harm theologically and practically in the teachings of the church. This idea that we are separate from the earth has enabled, economic abuse of the environment, exploitation of the environment, exploitation of each other. Capitalism is built on these ideas, and the teleological idea in religion, that our ultimate destination is some heaven that's outside of space and time, outside of our physical experience. That is something that we deal with in open and relational theology. So I want to ask you to say more about the spiritual being having a human experience. What are the indigenous thought processes with that? How have you built that into the framework of the Church of Psychedelics?
Big question, Joe.
Yeah.
And thank you. So there's not really, we can pick one of 100 doorways to enter into the answering of that. And again, this is all you can really have is a discussion around it. I don't know anything that I say is like the end answer or the final answer. I think it's things like, it's how you have, I would say the number one word is relationship. That is the number one. What is your relationship to things? Is how more Native Americans think about it. Is like, so when you have a relationship, like for instance, it could even be the relationship with how you ask a question. Like, I'll give you an example. Obviously, we're in a state of war and never-ending eternal wars around the world, and everybody's behind every little bit here and there, and you only get the sanitized news or whatever they want to tell us. So we don't really know. So somebody was at part of a discussion I was in. Somebody says, "Well, Doug, how do you find peace? What's the answer to finding peace?" And it was that's where I sensed from the indigenous teachings that I learned from, the question is different. We don't find peace. Because in my mind, if you would have asked me this like 15 years ago, I would have a completely different answer. I'd answer the question, how do you find peace? But over time, with that lived experience and other teachings, that's when I realized, I'm like, oh, we can't find peace. We choose peace. And that's like indigenous ways of just their thought process. They look like they're so, like when I say they look like what we're shown in Hollywood movies and books and, the little snippets of Native American wisdom, there's a wisdom that they're known for. There's like a stoicism to them, to this, that they're known for is, all the tribes kind of all melded together. There's stoicism and wisdom and a connection with the earth. So the answer to that was you don't find peace. We choose peace. And we don't just choose peace itself as an idea, we choose what not to give our energy to. Because it's like when they say, like, Michelangelo, when you do this statue, and he goes, well, I just basically remove all the pieces of the marble that is not the final art. That's what I'll do. He just removes whatever's left. Indigenous thinking is much the same. We choose peace by what we choose not to give our attention and energy to. We don't give it to conversations where we understand that behind those conversations is somebody's got an agenda for continuing war. Someone has the idea that they're going to present themselves for, it's the idea what we don't give energy to. We don't give energy to the negativity. We don't give energy to that. And what we do is we don't give our attention to the politicians when they're justifying the next attack or whatever it is. What we do is we hold them to certain things. Like we never ask, we don't ever, like there's a saying you probably heard, waging peace. You hear millions of times waging war, but are we literally waging peace? No, there's no profit in peace. There's only profit. There's massive amounts of mountains and mountains of profit in war and conflict, but there's not much money in peace. So we have to understand where our leaders are coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. I would say that's how we back up. And the first part's about how we enter this idea of how do we position it. So the idea of positioning it is how do we build relationships with these various questions? And then the second part about what I think a lot of people miss around spirituality is the integration. So relationships and integration, because you can have a really aha moment. You've learned something, or you go through a lesson, or you see God's grace come through, and you have an experience, and that's a peak experience. But and the peak experiences have a problem because people can learn to chase, these peak experiences, but it's really the integration about those peak experiences, about bringing that into our everyday life. Integration is healing. The ceremony is not the healing. The ceremony just is the thing that reveals what needs to be healed, right?
Right.
And so it's relationships and integration are the two key components about how we bring in these indigenous aspects into modern spirituality. We got to walk our talk, and that integration is how we do that.
I love it. Those are key pillars within ORT, within open relational theology. Specifically the openness. So the idea that this religious framework that you've established and that is catching on, not just in terms of like mainstream consciousness, but as a practical reflection of what people are longing for in their religious experience. I'm going to quote him again, but one of my former guests said that religion is the bureaucracy of spirituality. And I tend to agree with that mostly, except when you have a framework that is open, that allows people to come in and to experience the community and the integration that are necessary to evolve as spiritual beings and understand our relationality to everything. Like those are good frameworks, and we should be able to keep what works and what is good while we, criticize what needs to change and what is bad. So I love that. I love that openness, and I love the integration piece as well. Specifically, those really pop when we're using sacramental language to talk about psychedelics. Specifically when you said, it's not the experience or the ceremony that you need to hang on to, but it's sort of the revelation and the awakening, the brush with reality that people need to hang on to when they go through these experiences. And that just makes me appreciate so much more the framework that you set up in using that sacramental language to point out what you're doing. A sacrament even in classic theology, the sacrament is the embodiment of the truth that we are approaching. The thing that we want to experience is this mysterious sort of blend of the physicality, and the spiritual, that, spiritual being having the human experience. That's sort of the altar where it comes together. So I love that language that you're using. Let's talk about, you had said something that was a perfect segue into colonialism, and I mentioned some of my thoughts on that. And what I'm curious with this church framework is some of the legal language or the use of church and the protections of religion. Do you see those as essential to preserving both the indigenous teaching and experience that are integrated with this? And then also, let's talk about capitalism after that.
Sure. Another big questions all into the same idea. So to kind of break that apart, I'll talk about the sacrament part first. So it's really interesting. We use the word psychedelics because that's our Western language for it. The actual proper term is entheogens. That's the scientific term. And it's also been a historical term that goes back thousands of years, even pre-Christ. Entheogens it's rooted in Greek etymology, and entheogens, when you break it down, entheo, like en means within, it's inside. Mm-hmm. Theos means God or divine or the divinity, and gen means to generate or to come into being. And when you put all those together, entheogen together, then it basically means to bring God from within out, that which brings forth the divine. That's the translation, literally. So it means, the inward journey to discover God and then bring without. So entheogens, that's what it means. Now, just take that into any Christian-based or Catholic-based idea where they say the kingdom of God is within you. That is within, I think that's in Luke, the kingdom of God is within you. Well, what does that mean? The kingdom of God is within us. And then if you lay that right on top of the etymology of entheogens, that's exactly what it means, bringing God from within. So they already knew thousands of years ago, from a sacramental standpoint, what this natural medicine does. It expands awareness. So it takes you from your bias and your judgment and your predispositions and your prejudices and everything that has got you looking through this cone of awareness of how you see the world. And then what it does is through your biological system and the introduction of serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and endorphins, it basically drops this idea. It helps dissolve or soften the edges of your ego, what you think you already know is true, your illusion of separation, and it broadens out your awareness from here to here. And now you're seeing a much larger cone of awareness. And once you do that, you have to have the skills and the abilities and the foundational elements of practice, which they call mindfulness practices, in order to receive and understand and reorganize and position the new information that has now come through. Those mindfulness practices are things like meditation and breath work and journaling and prayer and those type of things to help put this newfound information and then bring it into you, so you have a much larger observational view of the world and yourself in it. So that's the first part, is the sacrament. The kingdom of God is within you. They already know the entheogens was literally the word they put right on top of it. These ideas are like thousands of years old. Keep in mind, that's thousands of years old. The United States, in a Western way of thinking, is a couple hundred years old. So as an entheon, it does not have to manufacture God. It is not God. It just simply helps remove the walls we built between ourselves and God. And that's another primary element of the Church of Psychedelics is kind of going back to what my father's experience was, is that you keep on going to these people that they seem to know more than you about the God. And so to have a relationship with God, you're going through a middleman, so to speak. Now, I'm not trying to put that all as bad, because this all about spirituality and religion is a lot about community as well, and helping each other, understand different experiences in life, and people who have thought about a certain way to give other people a framework and explain it. So I'm not saying all of that is bad. I'm just saying there's a much different relationship when you have a direct connection with God, the divine, source consciousness, and your own exploration in that. Because sometimes the wording of and the vernacular used in spiritual texts and tomes, regardless of the religion, is so esoteric or so mysterious and mystical that it's hard to understand. What does that mean to me right now? And we're always doing this interpretation. But if you have this direct relationship that you build, you're now communicating on under the way that you understand things. It's the same way just in school. Some people are auditory learners. Some people are visual learners. Some people are kinesthetic learners. They have to have their hand. They have to actually do it. Some people can read and learn, but public education just teaches you one way. And if you're not wired that way, you're going to struggle in school. And those that do learn that way, they exceed. The school does not adapt itself to how you learn. You just got to adapt how you learn to whatever is being put in front of you. Because remember, there's 30, 40 plus kids in the school for one teacher. You're not getting any help, direct help or anything like that. It's the same way with spirituality. So the best way to do it is have a direct relationship with God. And these entheogens help you have this idea to understand what you're experiencing at a more aware level about what that means to you. So the kingdom may not be somewhere we go after death. It just may be a level of divine awareness that we learn to enter while we're alive.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. I think, everything that you said, 100%. The idea that ego creates a separation, that classic theism reinforces that idea of separation, specifically as we talk about dualism, the idea that, that we're not connected to the earth, that we're not connected to the people around us, like that limits our capacity to fully experience the divine. Because using Christian language, creator is relationality. The triune God, if we want to use specific Christian language, is three separate but indistinguishable people, or distinguishable but inseparable people. It is a community that mutually defers to one another. That relationality is the framework for our existence. And in experiencing something, a sacrament that removes the illusion of separation, is critical to helping us to understand what it means to be in relationship with each other, with the world around us, with the divine. So that, I think it's an incredible way, especially, like I said, going back to your thought about, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the way that I took it is, that we're not dependent on these experiences, but these experiences are a way to help teach us the mindfulness practices that we need to sustain that experience. So this is one of many tools that should be in our toolkit that help us to break down ego and to experience the divine on a regular basis in our daily lives. So yeah, I love that. So let's talk some more practicality. I just want to hear your thoughts on the industrialization of natural resources like that, just, manufacturing, how this system, or whether this system is, sort of designed to protect the sustainability of these practices and of these plant medicines. Could you say more about that?
Sure. I think, the idea of colonialism started about 750 years ago or so, but it really started getting started about 750 years ago, because what was happening is two different things. A couple families of people would get together and they would basically write up some paperwork, and then they would claim that God ordained them with some sort of higher level of existence than you or I. Mm-hmm. And that made monarchies. And then we had kings and queens. And then all of a sudden, and those kings and queens basically kind of chopped up the land. And then the taxes that came from that land, if you were the manager of that land as a baron or whatever. You can create a royal role or title, and then they would give you part of that land in your job, and they would give you some henchmen as tax collectors. And then your job was to make sure that everybody in that particular area of land was under control, paying taxes. You kept a little bit of the haircut of those taxes, and you sent the rest to the crown. And then that worked out pretty well. Look at the crown. Look at how they lived versus the peasants, right?
Worked out pretty well for some
That worked
people.
out pretty well for some people, yeah. And then the crown goes like, wow, I want to continue this. I want more, right? That's the ego. What's in it for me? What's in it for me? What's in it for me? Ego. And then then all of a sudden you got a claim of divinity. God himself acknowledged that me and my bloodline are absolutely supposed to rule over you. And you're supposed to bow to us. Absolutely. God said it. And then they're like, we got to make sure that they don't start thinking for themselves, or they're going to realize that that's pretty not even logical. So we better get together with somebody who has the authority of God, and we better make some allies over there. So if we give them some money, then what they'll do is that they'll back us up. You pay to play, you pay enough, they'll tell those people, yes, you better listen to what that king or queen has to say, or God will, and then you get into the system of rewards and punishments.
Right.
So just
aside,
yeah,
that's some bullshit. To be clear, that's some bullshit that some people came up with, but classic theism reinforces that bullshit. When we talk about patriarchy, and we talk about divine right, and we talk about, the exploitation of people and dominance over creation and over each other, that's all backed up by classic theism, which is why we want to get away from that.
It's literally a fairy tale, not necessarily the part about God and the religion, but the fairy tale they put together between each other of rewards and punishments. And by divinity of God, I'm supposed to rule over you. That's my literal responsibility. Never mind the jewels and the castles, just, and the unlimited number of gold or whatever. But so what happens is now you've got this, right? Now it's rolling. And so what happens now is you're making enemies. And when you make enemies, now you've got to create defenses. And then once you have defenses, now you're in military strategy. Now you have the idea of preemptive strikes. And when you have preemptive strikes, now you need a war chest. And then now you got a war chest, now you need someone to back each other up. So now you've got a system of, okay, you've got the peasants, so that means you've got the army. But I'm over here on this other side and I've got divine authority. And so my divine authority means that those people who don't believe in God, they need to be taught a lesson. And they need God in their life. And the peasants are going, yes, they need to do what they need to believe what we believe. And then so somebody has got to bankroll the army. So now you have a bank, which is a church, a religion and religious institute. In that time, it was the popes. It was the head bankers, because they are the ones that had the money, right? Because they were the money rolls up, the money goes uphill, right? Somebody does the work, somebody gets paid for it, someone gets the taxes, they get a little bit, the big taxes go to the next level, and those taxes go to pay off, those ideas. So now you got one people looking at another people. And then when that happens is when they get into war, somebody wins. What do they win? Control over the land. What does the land mean? The land means we can cut it up. We can give our friends and our family some more things to rule over. We get those taxes. And then now we start to get the idea. Now this idea of corporatism starts to come in. Now we're making money. Now we've got a system of how to create revenue, right? And now we systematize revenue. We just put it into the idea of you're good and you're bad. And then we go to the people who don't believe like us, whether you could call it from one religion to another, you can call it an infidel, you can call from one religion to another, you can call them, savages. I think in the Constitution of the United States.
It is in the Constitution, people.
Yeah. We are literally, we are literally soulless savages. How do we put it? We are
merciless
Indian savages. That's literally what we're, merciless, meaning that we are beyond saving. We are merciless. We have no ethics, no morals. We are literally merciless. So we are less than animals, and we should be removed from this land as a scourge. Merciless Indian savages. So that's how we are. Below also in the Constitution, I think people of color are called chattel, human cattle. So anyway, it just goes. So anyway, we're kind of seeing the evidence that still, is around for that. But now we're moving into, now you have capitalism, right? Now making money is now an enterprise, and you make it, then other people are starting to live the good life and rule over others. So now it gets into the idea of like, how do we continue to do this? How do we systematize capitalism? And we systematize capitalism by doing things like figuring out how to destabilize governments. And once you destabilize the government, now you destabilize the political system. And then once you destabilize the political system, people are going to go to some sort of other organization. Their next set of organization is how they're spiritually organized, their religions. So we've got to destabilize those as well. And the way we do that is by saying what they're talking about is evil. It's against God. And we need to remove your spiritual advisors. So your shamans, your gurus, your medicine people, your priests, your acolytes, your whatever you are, right? You remove those, so there's no infrastructure inside of the religion. Now you've got full-blown colonialism, and you've got a system of emperors, and you've got a system of kings and queens doing battle, and then we've got industrialization is coming on. Industrialization is coming along, so now we're building ships. So now we can take our armies from one shoreline to another shoreline. Now it's spreading, and now we're setting up bastions of governments and military sites. Mm-hmm. And that we're getting really good because now we realize like food and fuel, and now we've got trade routes. And so now we can supply the armies with food. We can supply them with ammunition and fuel and communicate. And then we go further on. Now we got communications too. Now we can coordinate faster, and it just builds up and builds up to the point of, that's where we are. It's just more. And then the idea of how does that allow it? Greed.
Right.
Well, this idea of ego and greed comes together. And then you have this idea of, okay, well now what are the source elements of all of this? And it's two things. It's power and control. And if you can get your hands around power and control, those two things together, now you're wielding a really big gun to go around the rest of the world and make your way of however you want to make it.
So how do you operate within those frameworks to do the opposite? Because you're talking about an open and relational experience that anybody can come into and understand what it means to be connected to the divine, to be connected with each other. But obviously, as an organization in today's world, you have to exist to sustain that. So, there is some capitalism involved. There is some legal framework and protections that are involved. So how do you sort of walk that line of existing within broken systems to destabilize those systems ultimately, to work towards something better?
This idea of what's in it for me. I'm under no illusion that the changes that I would like to see in the world may never happen in my lifetime. That's the first thing you have to say, is you have to remove yourself. When you have faith, you have the ability, whether I'm alive here or I'm alive in the next world, I'm fine, right? My energy is going to continue. So this idea of ego, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? What's in it for me? We need to release that. If we really want to be in the vein of truth, of genuine authenticity, of this idea of then what's the best? I'm not here to be important. I'm here to be useful. That's what we're here. And if we come through that perspective, that lens, then I think that that's the first element of how we get there. How do we create a better world? It also relates to the phrase of when's the best time to plant a tree, like 30 years ago. When's the next best time to plant a tree? Right now, right? It's that same way of thinking. And if we approach it, how when you asked me the question of how I set up the structure, and I said the structure, I had to figure out how do you take this massive idea and start to make sense of it and your relationship to it by one single phrase. We are a spiritual being having a human experience, and those are two different lenses to work with. One is through the idea of awareness, which is the human experience. And then the word spiritual being comes from the idea of source, having the lessons and the understandings and the idea to contemplate source consciousness, God. We're an extension of that. And then we're here in this world. How do we walk around this world in a good way? And then we melt those two things together. And then it's a brighter, bigger expression of our humanity. And inside of that, once we understand the idea of faith and hope, two separate words, but faith, how do we have this idea of faith? How do we have this concept of how do we believe something without seeing it? Because the ego is very much in place of, I need to see something without, I need before I believe it. And now you're looking just through the lens of our humanity or science, which is totally fine, versus through the awareness of God and our level of our direct consciousness with it. So that's the idea of how we start to approach those two things. You were talking about sacrament earlier, and sacrament was very interesting because sacrament is that thing that kind of ties us to this ability between this believing something without seeing it and having to see before you can believe it. Sacrament is this kind of relationship that we have with divinity and our relationship to divinity. It even starts at the very beginning. What's the first book in
Genesis?
Genesis. Genesis 2:15 or 16 or 16 and 17. They talk about the fruit of the tree of knowledge, right? The apple was this symbol that became extremely popular, but it was not in the Bible. People could swear that the apple was in the Bible of when Eve took a bite of the apple and then gave it to Adam to do the same. It wasn't. It is never the apple. It was a word when the Bible was written hundreds of years later, right? In Latin, that word is malum, and malum has two words to it. It means apple, but it also means evil. The Bible doesn't tell us that. You have to go into other etymology and understandings and different dictionaries from other continents to understand that that's the connection. It never said ever that that was eaten was an apple. And again, you have to remember what the word fruit means. A fruit could be like an orange off of a tree. It is the ultimate condensed, focused element of all of the elements of that tree. It comes through in the fruit. It's kind of like you have a child. Your children are the representative of your relationships with your significant other. It's woven into it. So there's a lot of symbolism that has been said. It depends on the continent. Certain continents, it's not an apple. By the way, the apple only came from Western storytelling and Western artists, some European as well, but it was just made up not very long ago. Certainly not thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago, it was portrayed in certain parts, like in the Mesopotamia, figs, another element where they thought it was grapes. And the biggest one, actually the most accurate one, is a pomegranate. That's what they think. But if you go into the East, they'll talk about it being mushrooms. If you go to certain parts of, like around Turkey, modern day Turkey, that area of the world says it's mushrooms. And they have tapestries that are woven, and they have, what do they call it with the paintings, the paintings on the walls,
like
murals, and they go back thousands of years, or over 1,000 years, will show Christ with mushrooms. It's in there's a word for it when they paint it on the ceilings and on the walls that has mushrooms. In the texts, they say that the fruit is mushrooms, and in stained glass, early stained glass, there's elements of, when it's talking about the fruit, the fruit from the tree of knowledge has the stained glass imagery is represents it as mushrooms. So it's interesting because also part of, I think, Genesis 2:16, something like that, or 2:17, they talk about your eyes will be opened. Genesis 3 something, your eyes will be opened. So you've got this idea of this tree of knowledge, a fruit, people ingesting it, and that your eyes will be opened. Then and I should have studied up on some of this because I'm just pulling from memory, but then the eyes were both open when they both ate it. Don't you think that has something to do with like awareness? There is some very interesting language that if you go back to original language of what they're saying, acquiring knowledge, possessing wisdom, the ability to carry it and understand it and explain it to others. All of that is written inside of Genesis. Very compelling understanding of the human relationship historically with possible entheogens, from the etymological wording, from the storytelling, from going to other continents and seeing what original definitions of the wording in the Bibles are. So outside of our 250 years of understanding of the Bible, here how we've formed it up and made it deliverable from an American standpoint, there's a lot of other considerations about this idea. Now, I know I explained a lot, but it really goes back to the idea of sacrament. That's what Genesis is talking about. This expanded awareness is not automatic wisdom. You can open someone's eyes before they are ready to understand what they see. And that's one of the elements that I built into the Church of Psychedelics, is that I can help somebody open their eyes. But what I really need to do, are they ready to understand what they see? And that's where I feel that my work is helping them understand.
And that's where I'm curious about any of the tenets we explained, or you mentioned a little bit of the gold path. I think that's what we
The
call it,
golden
right?
path. Uh-huh.
The golden path. So I want to get into that a little bit, because just to deconstruct a little bit, the idea of sacrament, that's an embodied experience. I didn't say that earlier, but what sacrament does is the reason why it has to do with the elements, like communion, for example, is because it's not just deeply symbolic. It is that, but it is also physically embodying the experience, the nourishment that we take from the earth, or that we receive from the earth is a better word. Going in and becoming a part of us. So the sacrament as an embodied experience. And I think to deconstruct that Genesis passage is Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, where it says that their eyes were opened. I think, what if the warning not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge was simply because God knew that in our youth and inexperience, we weren't ready for that embodied reality just yet? Maybe that was always part of the plan, but maybe the transgression is that ego showing up, or that ego being created. This idea of separation, I know better, this idea of I'm ready, instead of the trust, instead of the relationship with Creator that was intended and that had started off that way. What if acting of our own volition, we took something that we weren't ready to experience yet? And so the question in there is, how does the Church of Psychedelics, in the framework that you've established, create that partnership that is necessary in the sacramental experience? Are the people who administer the sacrament, are they trained, or is there a framework of resources that people to go to have answers that they need for this to be like a guided experience, and not just something that we, are tripping out alone without the proper context for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Great question, Joe. Thank you so much. You again, one of those ones where you can pick up 50 different doorways to walk into that. So I think if you start coming back where you said with Genesis, and then it was offered this forbidden fruit, so to speak. Forbidden by whom is, I think, the first question to ask. And maybe it's us internally. Do you want to have this forbidden fruit of, like, there's a passageway, a threshold to walk through, an understanding of, do you want to have, what type of relationship do you want to have with divinity? And are you prepared for this are you prepared for the responsibility for this ability? Because if you do want to be prepared for responsibility, the number one thing that you have to do is take agency over your spirituality. Are you prepared to take agency over your spirituality? Because if so, it's going to be an interesting life, and it's not going to be easy. You're going to be taken out of all of those things, of all your protections and everything that you think that you know. And it is going to come into question of your literal existence and reality. Because if you're not prepared to handle that, then don't do it. That is forbidden from you, because that is irresponsible of you. So to become responsible, to show up as a sovereign human with agency over your spirituality, you have to become the mindset of a warrior to move into this, because you're going to come up against conflict. You're going to come up against obstacles. You're going to come with those things that you're going to have prices to pay for certain knowledge and wisdom. You when you're chosen to see something, or you opt in to seeing reality and truth, you put on those glasses and now you can see things for what they really are. That's a big responsibility, because once you see truth, you can't take them back off. And then you have to kind of see things in their raw form of what they really are, or, where the root source of what they come from. And when you start to see the world around you from the idea of colonialism, like we just talked about, and you're seeing the remnants of it and some of the modern day ways that it's still being practiced, that's a hard way to see the world. So the first pillar that we need in order to put on our armor of God, so to speak, is presence. So the first pillar that we teach is presence. Presence, in my perspective, is the practice that awakens all others. It's the way that you walk with Creator every moment of the day. Walking with Creator every moment of the day as some sort of lens that you have the ability to also look over the shoulder of Creator and see the world through that way. So when you walk with the Creator every day, it's asking to be able to have a relationship with truth. And when you have a relationship with truth, then you have a certain thing. So the first thing that comes through presence that I suggest we look into and how what we practice is responding versus reacting. That's the very first thing to basically create the trajectory first before you start walking a spiritual path. This ability to respond versus react. Because when you're reacting from all that automatic stimulus of knee-jerk reactions of past trauma and wounds that are still right underneath the surface of how you live your life and who you are. And when something happens to you, whenever you perceive something is happening to you, you're reacting with all those bias and prejudices and lived experiences that are directly attached to the very sensitive, unhealed wound of all of those elements. So you're reacting to stuff that you don't even know that you're reacting versus you're responding to something. So sometimes, like say somebody you work with says something to you that's really negative, or somebody cuts you off in traffic, or somebody does something in some way that it seems like it's an assault on you in some particular way, or a wrongdoing or a negative action, right? We see that. And so if we can be in the present moment and we have that experience happen to us, now we can start to look at it and say, like, a colleague that I just can't get along with, that throws me under the bus in their meetings and says really terrible things and tears apart my collaboration and contributions to the project or my job. They say bad things that can bring instability to my boss seeing the way that I do my work, and then I can't afford to be without a job, and on, right? It builds and builds. So instead of it seeing that way, I would look at the person and I would say, versus reacting to that, I would respond to that. And I would respond to that in certain ways. I would look at that person and go, wow, they're displaying something that is not very coming from the heart. They're displaying something and they're coming at me that could put me in jeopardy. And I know I'm not a bad person. And I know they're not a bad person, but they're doing it anyway. So you start to come with the idea of responding by saying, that person may be in a relationship that I am completely unaware of at home behind closed doors, that there's problems. Or they have certain situations there where they may be dealing with a family member where there's a problem, but there's no solution. They could be under an amount of anxiety or stress or having violence put upon them or be in a violent household, or they could be dealing with addictions, or they could be having family members that are dealing with addictions. They could have something so much going on that I just happen to be at the place and at the time where I'm the recipient of them being involved with something very bad that they don't have a solution for. And once I see that way I don't take it in those particular ways. And when you don't, there's elements that come out of this concept of responding versus reacting to where it can help that situation. Another one is the idea of like assuming positive intent. Someone cuts you off, you're on an exit trying to get on the highway, people aren't letting you in, and when they do, someone comes around you and takes your spot. Why did you do that to me? This idea of, why did you do that to me? What's in it for me? And so when you do that, assuming positive intent would be the person who just cut you off, maybe somebody didn't pick up their child from school and it's an hour late and their child's sitting in front of a school, vulnerable, scared. It could be that somebody fell at home. Their mom fell at home. Their 80-year-old mother fell at home and she's hurt now. They've got to get some. So the idea of assuming positive intent is that whether they did something because they truly are a jerk, or that there is some other reason that this thing that you felt they did it to you, either way you win. It's kind of like when I say, like, worrying is a complete waste of your imagination. Why worry? If you literally don't know what the outcome is going to be, if you don't know what it could either be terrible, like you're worried about, anxiety about, having depressed about, or it could turn out just perfect, even better than you thought. If you don't know how it's going to turn out, you might as well put your mindset on how it's going to turn out in a positive way from you than a negative, because it's going to happen no matter what. So you might as well spend the time over here versus over there. Nothing comes great out of worrying.
That's a good segue into manifesting, the idea of creating or co-creating our reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. So I think we've covered all of the major questions that I have about the framework. It's been a good conversation.
Good.
I think so. I'm curious if you could tell us more about the church, how it exists, like maybe the organizational framework and the polity? Do you have like a headquarters? Are people being taught as practitioners to be able to like start their own group as a part of the church? Or how does all of that work? Because I think a quick Google search will pull up Colorado, but also like California. So I don't know, are there other churches or do you have multiple locations? How does that work?
Yeah. So our website is thechurchofpsychedelics.com.
Hmm.
And, when this idea came up, a bunch of the DEA calls them lightly veiled schemes. Now, they said that basically there's a lot of lightly veiled schemes of churches that pop up with just basically a lightly veiled scheme to sell psilocybin. Part of colonialism and colonization, the same capitalism, the same way. They're going to find something, somebody can make some money off of it. They put together a lightly veiled scheme. They're all of a sudden, everybody gets all spiritual about mushrooms. All of a sudden, you know,
Hmm.
as if that's always been there. And then it's just a play on capitalism, really. So ours is more, we have it's a sincere spiritual belief system around plant medicine that comes from thousands of years of tradition that's kind of summed up into the modern world of what we're dealing with right now and how we're having to be organized in order to operate with our sincere belief system under this Religious Freedom Restoration Act that allows anybody with a sincere belief system that wants to work with natural psychedelics in order to help with their path of spiritual development, to expand their awareness and have a deeper relationship with source consciousness or God and have those ideas. So what we did is we created an environment, and that environment supports that particular relationship. That's where we really lean into that element of the relationship between natural psychedelics and humans on a spiritual path of development that want to work with expanded awareness and deep consciousness. That's specifically what we do. That's our members. That's what we do. Now, the other part is, do we have a way to train and create others that can help train this and share the message? And the answer is yes. We call those. That's a part of the process that we're working on now. You have to remember that a lot of this only passed in 2022, the law. So it only had us the ability to kind of come from behind the scenes into more of a public awareness.
Hmm.
And so in 2022, then the state of Colorado was supposed to have it done in like 6 or 9 months to have the Department of Regulatory Agency set up, but it took them 2 years. And so now we're in 2024 into 2025. So that's just last year when they basically got their act together and, to be that part of it. Now, again, that's for the regulatory agencies. We're doing separately. We're taking the spiritual path to this. So anyway, that's kind of like so first part is keeping in mind the amount of the time frame that we are in.
Hmm.
So now what we're doing is we've taken the first part to build all of our infrastructure, to build all of our teaching systems, to get out there and to formalize everything. So now the next part is to the expansion of the church itself. So we've probably, we have members. Membership is open to everybody. We are all religions welcome. This is not to replace any religion that you're practicing right now. It is to, again, to create a community, a spiritual community with a belief system defined as a religion in order to help people have the tools and the processes and the practices to learn from, to have a relationship with God through these plant medicines. That's a certain perspective of their spirituality or their religious belief system. So that's how we approach that part of it. So yes, if anybody's interested, the first thing to do is sign up for our newsletter, because our newsletter, it tells everything that we're doing currently every single week.
Hmm.
Classes and courses and workshops and retreats, or, sermons and podcasts and all that stuff. And I think just about on every page, somebody can find our newsletter. So just go to the churchofpsychedelics.com, find and sign up for the newsletter. Now there, when we start to open this up for people to help, because it takes a period of time, right? Someone just can't come in and teach this. They have to practice it first. So we're in the state of practitioners.
Do you have is there a specific community that you're working with, a specific Indigenous community? Do you have practitioners there that are sort of the primary core that are making this a reality for you and that will be, sort of mentoring new people? Or are you still working on that framework as well?
Yeah. We have a spiritual council, and we have chiefs. It's also, when we all kind of we're also bringing the lineage of the wisdom holders of other elders that have made it through. And like I said, we are inspired by a lot of core source spiritual concepts and teachings and lineages and things like that. So I may not talk about other stories or other, events or, other sacramental type concepts that other religions have. But when we talk about the core elements, like, for instance, I once heard I forget his name, a very advanced theologian who read every, from his 50 or 60 years of being, this philosopher about religion. He said that every single sacred text, tome, book, script, or a scroll, everything that he was able to find, from Buddhism to Taoism to, Judaism or Christianity or Muslim or Hindu, all of them. He said basically there was two things that they all, when you distill down outside of all the stories and concepts and timelines and who's right and wrong and all that, he said they all shared two concepts: love and forgiveness. They all had two primary elements of narrative thread through all of their sacred texts and tomes around two ideas that had the wellspring of forgiveness and the wellspring of love. Those two, love and forgiveness. And so what I did was to make sure that a lot of what we did came from those two different sources. And that's how we started.
Awesome. So churchofpsychedelics.com
Yes.
is where people can get in contact with what you're doing. What other ways can they reach out to you or to the community if they have questions or if they want to explore more?
Yes. So go to the churchofpsychedelics.com. And like I said, all religions welcome, all people welcome. All you just become a member. And by becoming a member, all that is you are just, the first thing about being a member is just getting involved with our communication. That's the first part. And once you get part of that newsletter, there's a lot of different ways. Like you can ask questions or contact us forums, or, you'll get a login to a back-end community site through Mighty Networks. It's so you can come in and be a part of our community, ask questions. There's conversations happening in there. We have polls. We have all updates of upcoming, different activities we're doing. So just that's the first part, is once you start to get in, and I'm right in there, so you'll be able to ask me direct questions. I'm there to help you to integrate with working with psychedelics. We specifically start with microdosing psilocybin. That's the easiest way. You start the introduction of psilocybin in a very sub-perceptual way into your daily life. So you start to build a consistent relationship with it. Remember, these things I know this is weird. This is going to be probably the most out there thing that I'll say, but these are certain medicines that they have sentience. They just literally do. They're the fruit of some of the most highest level forms of intelligence that there is. There's a lot of philosophers right now, right now in the United States, the government's talking about releasing information about aliens and UFOs and all that stuff. And so there's kind of a conversation happening about, well, who should they, if you could introduce the aliens of someone to speak for humanity, who would it be? And there's a lot of philosophers who's very interesting. I was asked this question too, and someone brought this to my attention when I said, well, I would introduce them to mycelium. Like, that's probably the most intelligent, that has the ability to have the history and the forward. It's not just humans. If you said, take me to your leader, I wouldn't take him to any leader that I know of right now. They're just agents of colonialism and capitalism. I understand the source elements of all those. I would take him to any leader that I can think of. Maybe, I don't know, like Jim Henson of the Muppets, maybe souls like that.
Mr. Rogers. Where's Mr. Rogers when you need him?
Steve Irwin,
Yeah.
like those are some males. I'm sure there's females out there as well, but yeah, like certainly wouldn't be like Mother Teresa or anybody like that, but maybe like Maria Sabina of the Mazatec people, where she was working directly with plants every day and talking with them and communicating with them.
Mm-hmm.
She is the grandmother of, psychedelic mushrooms. That's where, people like, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but like, a lot of the celebrities that start, we're talking like in the 60s and 70s and 80s about mushrooms, they took the journey down to Mexico to visit her and her tiny little community. That's where they learned about. That's how Western civilization actually learned about magic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, was from her.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's to get involved, I would say, is the first part about membership. And then that's the best way.
And in some of those conversations that you're having in that community, do those involve other substances, other psychedelics, other traditions that deal with this? Is that part of what you're developing as like sort of the mimetic framework of how this all came to be?
Yes. So We are very open to some others. Right now, we are really just working with the medicine of psychedelic mushrooms, specifically psilocybin.
Hmm.
However, we are like, there are things that are happening currently right now, a little bit off to the side around DMT,
Hmm.
but natural DMT, and then also things like mescaline. But those are different pathways for different reasons. And right now, again, kind of keep in the mind the era of time that we are in. It would be like, this, like when alcohol broke itself from prohibition, it'd be like 18 months ago. So things are just now happening. And
Right.
I don't really like the analogy or the parallel to alcohol. It's just, I'm saying that something that was available and then not available and then available again. It's just,
Right.
that is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
And
Yeah.
but
You're
on a
on the ground floor. You're on the
Right.
front lines of popular consciousness.
Right. And with the responsibility, I'm not here to sling mescaline or, and those come with very, very well already established spiritual ways of practice and being and understanding, right? The one that's most available to everybody, like, I would not suggest anybody just start with DMT or mescaline or anything like that. It's not that they're more powerful in any way, but they will definitely take you deeper. They are, like we were talking about before, they are ill-equipped to deal with the understandings that those medicines have to deliver. And if you approach anything with disrespect, like, for instance, like anything, like it's a foundational item, like an element, like fire, right?
Hmm.
Just, if you want to learn respect, go ahead and disrespect fire. You're going to learn a lesson about respect really fast.
Hmm.
Like, fire will teach you a lesson. It doesn't care about your money. It doesn't care about your status. It doesn't care about how good looking you are. It doesn't care about your role in life. It doesn't care about anything. Fire will teach you a fast lesson if you disrespect it,
Hmm.
or you treat it without care, right? Or without honor. So will these medicines. So therefore, you got to be trained to do it. You've got to build a relationship, a respect, an understanding, a background, an approach that fits who you are, where you're ready, a dosage, a level of experience, right? All of those things are in consideration. So yeah, right now, psilocybin is like THC.
Hmm.
It's like cannabis. Cannabis is an ally of humans. It literally is meant to be above as below. Literally, the above is the cannabis plant, the below is the mycelial network, whose fruit is mushrooms. It's meant to be recreational. It's meant to be spiritual. It's meant to be both. We're humans, and we do have recreational experiences. We do have deep esoteric experiences. It's a part of the tapestry of the human endeavor and experience. So these two things there are mirrors to each other, above and below, right? Open, inviting, simple doorway. You can have a very big experience and not be prepared for it. People call that a bad trip. But remember, what these mushrooms are specifically meant to work with is that anything that is not love will rise to the top of your life to seek healing. And when you put those with mushrooms, then if you're working with it in a respectful, trained, like, supported relationship around harm reduction, which are the things that we help with, then you can have that relationship will give you these understandings and insights and lessons that really have the ability to really create a brilliant life, a more rich life of texture and context around who you are and your life in it, rather than just paying bills and waiting for retirement, or waiting
Right.
for the next vacation 18 months from now or whatever. You get senses. It really seeps into your life and soaks it in, and it allows you to walk around with a full experience of this human endeavor.
You said that pillar of presence, being present to what is going on today, being embodied.
Emotional mastery, strengthening relationships. Presence is clarity. Presence is alignment.
Hmm.
Presence in spirituality, presence in your creativity, like principles of oneness and unity, these ideas of finding peace versus choosing peace, reflections, what is the implication to our humanity with nature, with science, with
Hmm.
medicine, all of that. So even though it's a simple word, presence, its roots go into all of those different things, and when the roots come back up and it brings that energy back up through the trunk and out into the leaves and the expression of the branches and the leaves of what people will see you, and you're not looking at it, like I said, for attention necessarily, but you're going to see a difference in how you act and you operate in the world.
Right. Authenticity.
True authenticity,
Right.
genuine,
Not about attention, but
right?
being rooted in who you are and
Rooted
where you
authenticity,
are.
not shallow authenticity, right? People walking around with their mala beads and their Buddha tattoos, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you're trying to like portray the world to see you in a certain way, actually, versus actually being a certain way.
Which
And
is
it's
a good
okay.
summary for
Yeah.
the ideology behind plant medicine and in integrating that into our spiritual practices. These are the things that we need to learn and that we need to incorporate fully, and not just give a passing nod to.
It's true
It's
sacrament.
A way of life.
It absolutely is. It's a way of life. It's a particular way, but it is a way, and it's a true way, and it's a way that has been around for thousands of years.
Hmm.
And I'm a follower of the teachings of Christ consciousness. I'm a
Hmm.
follower of Buddha consciousness. I'm a follower of a lot of different, and they have different roles and they have different meanings of life and different, approaches. And there's lots of ways to God. There are many paths to God. Those are all the ones that you look around and see right now today. They're good ones. And also, so is the Church of Psychedelics. It's a good one because this is the one that deals very specifically with a very specific path about building a relationship with natural medicine, specifically for the expansion of awareness and to have a deeper relationship with our consciousness. And those are both really big. They can be confusing. They can be vague. They can be mystical, right? So what does it mean to me? And so we help to land some of those big concepts around the type of big questions that, psychedelics bring to the surface of our life.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate your time and the care that you came into this conversation with. And I'm happy to help promote what you've got going on. I would encourage people to get in touch and to check it out, follow what's going on in the Colorado State Legislature with all of this, and follow Church of Psychedelics and ask questions and get involved.
Yeah, and it's not just Colorado. If you would like to work with psychedelics and, come inside a little bit further of what we're doing, then it's most states that we have the ability to deliver sacrament to.
Hmm.
And if you follow, I think it's about 35 states at the moment. But yeah, if you want to, come in, become a member, start to look through some of the welcome information that we have and the introduction of what, the systems and processes that we have. And then as
Hmm.
part of that, of you becoming a member of the Church of Psychedelics, that you have the ability to receive sacrament and work with it as part of your spiritual development.
Excellent. Thanks again. Is there anything else you want to share to promote yourself or the work that you're doing? Any upcoming books or partnerships with anybody that we should be
Really,
aware of? You're
yeah,
busy enough, but
yeah, there's a breath of life being breathed into this spiritual community and movement of what we're doing. It's growing really fast, as you can imagine, and I'm trying to keep up, even myself personally. So what I'm doing is the next part is the Golden Path. I'm putting that into a book. Of course, the teachings are online and that type of stuff, but memorializing it into like a base text book that's coming up. But there's so many other cool things. We're working on vision boards that are, that has a technology behind that to help people. Remember we were talking about some people have to see something in order to believe it, or some people have a skill to believe something without necessarily seeing it. It's that type of thing as well. So we're working on that type of technology. There are Oh my gosh, there's so many amazing projects. We're doing like microdosing mushrooms and hiking right now. We're doing microdosing in yoga. We have a retreat coming up at the end of next month that you'll see. It's called Dose and Flow. It's in the Rocky Mountains and it's beautiful. It's a 3-day event, so people can see that. So there's just a lot of we're getting collaborations coming at us from every angle. And if your audience or your listeners, like they have some sort of cool relationship or institution or organization or some sort of skill set or ability that they have, come on board. Let us know if this is of interest to you and you want to help. There's so many different ways that we could use help right now, and your expertise and your networking and all of those type of things, like it is growing incredibly fast. And we could use all the help we can get to get the word out to the world in a bigger way about the safe and intentional use of natural psychedelics as part of a spiritual path and belief system.
yeah, excellent. Well, everything will be in the show notes that you mentioned, and I'll keep in touch for sure. Definitely do
Yes,
the
thank you.
same
Absolutely.
with me, and we can have continued conversation about what's going on legally and promote different events and things like that. But this is definitely something that I'm curious about and that I need to experience for myself as well.
Absolutely. And Joe, I just want to say thank you to your listeners. And because this is new, it's very bold and we have to reposition certain things in a way, and certain things will make sense to you and certain things won't. And that's fine. But I think the idea is let's see things clearly for what they are. And these type of things like, the pharmaceuticals will come along and they'll try to synthesize this molecule into something and, try to sell it to you through doctors and stuff like that. But that's a zombie molecule, right? The hands of humans reached into it, moved around the molecular structure, and then all of a sudden you're going to have something that never had side effects before, all of a sudden has a laundry list of side effects. That's what they
Right.
do. But
Yep.
there's natural psychedelics in its most purest raw form. And I think if we have that study and we work with this way, that's truly powerful. That's true medicine, genuine medicine. And I think that how we make the world better is through a discussion and a responsible and intentional use of that.
Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
And to quote the beloved Ted Lasso, be curious. Don't judge. Be curious. So bring that curiosity to the conversation. Let's have conversation. Let's support it and protect it in the way it's meant to be. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, Joe, and thanks for the extension of time. I really appreciate that as well. And seriously, it's an open invitation. What we get, like a week or two out, and if you want to reach out to me, and I'd love to have you on my podcast as well.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. I appreciate it.
The depth and the quality of questions you ask it's obvious and it's right there. And I really appreciate just the spiritual intelligence behind the conversation.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. I'm very interested in indigenous ideas and that framework. Anything that is alternative to the conservative, white, evangelical spirituality that I was given, and that I participated in. So this is a step in the direction of reclaiming, my spirituality and really just owning who I am and what I'm interested in. So
what heritage are you? What's your background?
So I grew up Catholic, actually. And very early on, I felt called to be a spiritual leader. And so I interpreted that as a calling to be a priest. And, was interested in studying to do that. But then after I was finished with Catholic school, so my freshman year of high school, my parents had connected with a pastor across the street, and we started going to an evangelical church called the Church of the Nazarene. And so I was Nazarene for as long as I was Catholic. But because of my sensitivity to the spiritual and my desire to be fully engaged with that, I reimagined that calling and was a pastor within the Church of the Nazarene for 15 years. So I went from mainstream Christianity to conservative evangelical Christianity. So I definitely swung on the spectrum of what Christianity sort of has to offer. But right now, because of the trauma that we experienced, I'm just so open. It broke me open, and I would consider myself spiritual and not religious. But that's the language that I work with, the vocabulary of Christianity. So open and relational theology has been a valuable sidestep for me to continue to engage with these ideas in the vocabulary that I know, but in a way that opens it up to other traditions and other experiences and things like that. So I appreciate that the most about ORT.
Mm-hmm. What would you consider yourself now?
Nothing. I'm not necessarily comfortable calling myself a Christian just because of how problematic that is. But I'm still drawn to the story of Jesus, or, technically he was Jewish and his name was Joshua. So I jokingly tell people I'm really into the story of Joshua in what he taught and practiced. I think that that's enough to say to most Christians to get them uncomfortable with the fact that the Jesus that they're given is so far removed from what he actually taught and who he actually was, how he lived. I'm more interested in that embodied experience, that indigenous brown-skinned Jesus that walked the earth.
It was in Shambhala Buddhism to where it would really open my eyes. So there was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was a Rinpoche at Highland, and he was literally kind of one of those stories, contemplating his navels in the Himalayan cave. Mm-hmm. And during the communism, the era of communism at that time, when China invading into Nepal and those areas, they were assassinating their spiritual leaders. Well, they had also people inserted into the communism that were also Nepalese and different nationalities. So they had people that were giving them like the rebellion, the
Hmm.
insiders. And they
Yeah.
had been saying like, guys, you got 24 hours, like from the communist China's, we're getting word to Nepal saying in 24 hours the Chinese know that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche is in that cave. They're gonna go assassinate him next. You've got 24 hours to get there. So the monks got there, they got him, they smuggled him out of the country, got him
Hmm.
into Europe from somewhere, I can't remember, France maybe. They got him to United Kingdom. From the United Kingdom, they got him to New York City, and from New York City to Colorado.
Hmm.
So he's basically in a very short amount of time, he has from being from, a Rinpoche in a cave in Nepal in the Himalayas to Colorado to set up, one of the fifth lineages from Bala. It was really interesting because the reason I say that whole little story right there is because one thing that I learned in Shambhala, which was that it's very interesting when I was going back to these continents, these countries that have existed for thousands of years without a
Hmm.
break, the United States, which is a couple hundred years, the information is we've made enemies out of China and Russia in these places, so they don't share their knowledge. And we have no idea what's going over there on a daily basis. Some of the biggest land masses in the entire world, things are happening and have happened for thousands of years. They actually have collections to tell us what happened to Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30. They know where he was. They talk about his travels. That doesn't make it through to us. And that blows my mind. They have other stories that, didn't make it out of the, cutting room floor of the Council of Nicaea. They have those pieces together. They know more about Christianity than practically what we do in the West, but they won't share it with us. We made enemies of them. There's so many obstacles and barriers and filters we don't know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's really like those missing years and what was happening. And there's other Bibles like in Nigeria that exist, there's another version of it that's in a tomb that is guarded day and night by a certain tribe that has never left that carved in, area in the desert. It's crazy what's available that we're the tip of the iceberg of what we really know.
Right. And that's what fascinates me too about indigenous culture, like you said early on, being so close to the ancestors in terms of ideology, in terms of practices, in terms of just the way that information was handed down. I know that different cultures are considered primitive by Western ideology just because they are primarily oral and they practice apprenticeship and in passing down through lineages. But it's so fascinating to be that close to in thought and in practice and in appreciation for your ancestors' lived reality. That is something that we lose when we buy into the myth of whiteness, especially.
Yeah. It's
So,
actually through Buddhism where I learned that a major platform of the church was that Peter, that when they said that you're the rock for build my church, they show that is literally not at all. That in Buddhism, they have texts and tomes and a lot of them that shows that it was supposed to be built upon Mary.
mm, yeah.
And they talk about it, and you don't have to do much. You can actually probably Google it, and you just say, what is Buddhism? Because remember, there's 5 lineages, and each one of them, there was a lot more than that before communism came in the 50s and 60s and murdered them and burned their temples and burned these tomes that existed for several thousand years before Jesus. So a lot of those, some of those are kept, but now they're hidden. And to some of them, you can actually Google and text passages to where they say, because they actually there's a lot of discussion about Jesus visited the East as part
Hmm.
of that between he was 12 and 30. There was a long period of time where he shows where he traveled, but it's just a missing period of time in most of Christianity, but not in other cultures. They may be different religions, but they have experience with Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe that. Let's talk some more
You
for
got
sure.
it, Joe. It was a really pleasure, and I'm glad that we're creating this friendship. Thank you so much. Talk soon.